Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg, as usual, proudly powered by Research Luxembourg and recording at the RTL City Studios. And in today's episode, our guest is Professor Anna-Lena Hoegenauer, who studied European politics at King's College London and the College of Europe in Bruges, and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Edinburgh. She joined the Institute of Political Science of the University of Luxembourg in 2014 and is currently Associate Professor. Her research includes questions of multi-level governance, Europeanization, and the role of parliaments. Anna-Lena, thank you very much for coming today.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
You have a little bit of an uncomfortable position because you're the first political scientist in the show, so you will have to really re-explain the world to me. And we start with probably a tricky question, but we'll see how you manage to answer that. I've been thinking that a lot of scientists that I had here are kind of focusing on explaining the world in a way. They do the research because they say, like, I don't know why this works this way. Or maybe they want to improve certain processes, improve the health of the population. What about political science? Is that improving the process that we have already? Is it understanding how it works? How do you look at it yourself?
I think the basic idea is actually very similar to the natural sciences, where, for example, you want to understand why cancer happens and then ideally also try to find out how you fix it. And it's actually the same logic in political science, just that we focus on the functioning of political institutions and processes. And of course, in our context, democracies and how well they function, what kind of institutions work best. We try to learn from different countries. And so in a way, over time, we also try to improve our own political systems.
In a way, it's man-made. I mean, democracy comes from the man. It was the rules that we set up. So in a way, we should know how it works, but it's still kind of a test bed, isn't it? Depending on the political representation, the people who chose, everything else.
Indeed, because the different countries, even among the different democracies, we have different electoral systems that produce different dynamics. The institutions have different levels of power. So some parliaments are very powerful. In some countries, it's the government or the president that is very powerful. We have different cultures that also feed into how people behave in institutions or how voters behave. So these different processes, they all play together in politics.
And simply also the fact that, like in Luxembourg, you are actually required to vote. Let's put it this way, if not to say forced. So if you're really a Luxembourg national, you go and vote. And in other places, it might be just optional. You do it or you don't. And that also definitely influences the whole dynamics, I would say so. And I'm talking about Luxembourg because I feel a little bit bad that I'm introducing political science only now. And of course, before the elections. And I know that journalists have this tendency, probably you have more phone calls. It's like, oh, the elections, we need a specialist. Now she will tell us something. And I also know that you're not, of course, going to tell us a lot about the local elections in Luxembourg that are coming soon, because you're more focusing on the European level. But for sure, we'll be talking a little bit about the situation, how it is in Luxembourg. So how do you look at the landscape here in Luxembourg when it comes to elections, when you compare to other states? Which states do you compare with? Do you compare general? Do we talk small states in this case? What could you tell us about the landscape here?
I think when I look at the Luxembourgish political landscape, I think of other European countries that I'm familiar with. So, for example, Great Britain, where I've lived, the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium. And so I try to understand the different political cultures in the population electoral systems and the results that this produces. For example, when you compare the Luxembourgish and the British system, you see some really big differences. So in Britain, you have mainly three parties and two big ones. So politics are very adversarial. So you have two parties that really confront each other. Luxembourg has far more parties, but they are actually occupying what we call a narrow political space. Meaning, if you try to sort of map them on a 10-point scale, they are actually all sort of in the middle. The CSV is really centrist. Even the ADR is just a little bit to the right. The other parties are mostly slightly to the left, but they are actually all more or less clustered together. And they are actually none of the parliamentary parties are really outliers. So that's very different from the British system, where the Conservatives are clearly on the right and Labour is clearly on the left.
But it's also very typical, I think, we could talk about a certain crisis of the left and right nowadays. It's sometimes really difficult. I have this feeling, I'm listening to some politicians, I'm like, that must be, without looking at them, that must be like leftist approach. And then I'm like, okay, it's not, right? There is definitely some noticeable change in that kind of clear definitions that were there before.
Yes, and I mean, one thing that was always there is that you have different dimensions to the left-right scale. So, for example, you have an economic left-right scale, where on the right you would have economic liberals who want free trade and little regulation. And on the left you would have the more socialist parties that emphasize workers' rights on protectionism, things like this. But you also have a cultural left-right scale, where, for example, you might be against migration on the right, in favor of protecting your national language, but also strict laws against crimes and so on. And on the left, more in favor of migration, in favor of cultural diversity, more lenient on the criminal side. And so these two scales, they don't align. So a party can be on the right economically and on the left socially, or the other way around.
As I asked about Luxembourg, I also have to ask that question because we said already there is this European approach that you have, and the Luxembourgish, as we are based here. How European are Luxembourgers in general? When it comes to Europeanization of the landscape and the governance, where are we here?
Luxembourg is one of the most pro-European countries in the European Union in general. So if you ask people if they are in favor of European integration, they're usually 80% of people or even more who support European integration. And that value is actually relatively stable over time, even during the crises. That also has an impact on parties, of course, because when you have very few people who are skeptical of European integration, that doesn't really give you much room as a party. It doesn't make it very attractive to be anti-European or to, campaign for Luxembourg leaving the European Union. So we have these parties that are all very pro-European, very similar. And again, minor differences. So the CSV may be looking a little bit more at the Christian conservative dimension culturally, the LSRP being in favor of a social dimension to European integration, but it's very, very minor differences. And that, of course, makes it difficult for our foreign residents because they come from other countries. They don't know the Luxembourgish parties. And now they have to find a new party to support. And if the parties are relatively similar, and as I said, they are both nationally clustered in a really small political space, but also on the European dimension very similar, then that can make it really difficult to find your new party.
You make me feel better now, because I have to say that I'm proudly voting this year for the first time. I got the nationality and I can finally go and decide. And it's been a while. I'm trying to decide and I'm still undecided. So this is good to hear that it's normal to kind of be a bit confused with the political landscape.
And indeed, you can also see that, for example, when you look at the registrations of foreigners, the people who are willing to vote, that there are huge differences between nationalities. So the Germans are much more likely to register to vote than, for example, the Chinese or the Eritreans. And of course, that has something to do with the similarity of the party system that, of course, they're not identical, but the German parties are still relatively similar to the Luxembourgish ones. So you can just move across lazily from your German party to your Luxembourgish sister party, and that's it.
Okay, I also think it's very much cultural thing, the whole idea of the right to vote and wanting to vote. I do consider Germans, if I may, maybe that's going to be stereotypical, more involved in political life and kind of more thinking, okay, my right to vote, my choice, I'm going to influence certain things. And I would say that, for example, as I'm from Poland, we have a bit of a different, of course, history and different approach to that. We are way more against stereotypes from my perspective, way more going against than for something. And that's also definitely influences how many people sign up to vote here. I would assume so. I don't know if you agree with me.
Yes, definitely. And then that also makes it very difficult if your political parties and the dynamics are very different. That makes it very difficult for you to, again, find a party that suits your general attitude to politics.
Yes, that is for sure the case. Okay, but that's the national level or local, whatever we want. And now we're going a bit more European. And I'm opening a Pandora box, I have to say, because if I look at my friends and we start talking European elections, most of them are like, wow, nah, I don't know. There's this thing there where you live, like Luxembourg or Brussels or something, or Strasbourg, and it doesn't have much influence. Okay, I'm being very controversial because I know this is the subject you study and it's important for you. But there is still that feeling, I would say, in some, at least, circles that, there is not that much of influence of the European Parliament over our lives in the European Union. What do you say to that?
Well, that's the tricky thing, because Europe is actually doing a lot of things in a lot of areas, and it is having a relatively strong impact, in fact, on our everyday lives. And of course, you see it, there are the standard examples like Erasmus exchanges for students, the roaming fees on mobile phones that were abolished by the European Union. But there's a lot, for example, in environmental policy making that is most of environmental laws in Europe actually influenced by the European Union, not really just by the national level. And so you have a huge amount of, almost every policy area is guided nowadays also by European legislation.
So I should kind of learn more and read more, especially because we have this tendency of saying, oh, we are in the heart of Europe. We have the institutions here. So yes, okay, I will do a bit more reading next time. I promise I will know more. But on that subject, I mentioned this a few times already, is this one of the subjects that you study, the Europeanization. I want to understand that. So we're going a bit more, as I said, wider. We'll come back to Luxembourg at a certain moment as well. But for now, wider. How would you define Europeanization of national governments? Because when I was reading your papers, there was a lot of discussion of that. And I was a bit confused. What is that? I mean, national governments are separate. Europe is separate. Sometimes they kind of cooperate. But why Europeanization? What do we mean when we say that?
Europeanization actually refers to the impact of European integration onto the way that, for example, institutions or policies function.
And then when we talk about the different governments, what is the level? Do we see huge discrepancies between the governments? Are there certain tendencies that reflect actually also how the citizens perceive Europe? Is it related? How European the governments are in comparison to how European the citizens are?
Well, that is the thing. I would not confuse being pro-European with being Europeanized. Actually, sometimes pro-European states can have, or their politics are sometimes not that Europeanized. For example, in Luxembourg, one of the side effects of most parties being pro-European, except for the ADR, which is a bit Eurosceptic, but also not radically anti-European, it means that we rarely discuss European issues really in politics because we all agree on that. So our political discourse most days isn't very Europeanized. We mostly think about national things, and if something happens on the European level, we simply agree. Whereas in states where the population is more divided, you might have much more of a debate on European issues. So in a way, the public space might be much more Europeanized because people have to take into account what is actually happening on the European level.
And is it because the laws are further away from what the decisions are at the European level, that there is this kind of a clash? Could we say that? That is just, again, culturally, historically, these governments are too far away in order to actually approve and include those changes in the systems?
Yes, so I think that is one element that, for example, Luxembourg is among the states that founded the European Union. And because we've been there from the start, we've managed to shape it. So it suits us in a way. It's our baby. And of course, states that joined later sometimes never quite managed to fit in. So best example is, of course, Great Britain, even so it already joined in the 70s. It joined mainly for economic reasons. There wasn't much of a strong pro-European feeling. It was really, really based on profit, the kind of how can we profit from Europe. And then, these institutions that were molded by France and Germany, they just didn't fit Britain. Agricultural policy, for example, major spending policy, didn't fit Britain at all. So when Britain went through an economic crisis, it became one of the poorest states in Europe, but it actually had to pay into the budget. So that's like us asking Greece today to finance Denmark, which made very little sense. And so there are real problems sometimes with latecomers than, fitting into the European construct.
And then we have what we have, as you said, Brexit. So that's, again, a different subject, and I don't want to delve too much on it because I think we would not discuss everything else we prepared today. And we also prepared the pub quiz question that is coming back a little bit to Luxembourg, again, European Parliament and other ideas that you prepared. So if you can ask the question and listeners remember the answer only at the end of the podcast.
The pub quiz question is about the core of my research, the role of parliaments in the European Union. And when most people think of parliaments in the EU, they think of the European Parliament. But actually, it's not the only parliament involved. National parliaments also play a role, for example, by controlling what their government does in the Council of Ministers. And they have different levels of power in different member states. So my pub quiz question is, if you look at the powers of the different parliaments in EU affairs, how is the Chambre des députés ranked among the EU's 27 national parliaments. Is it the best? Is it the 10th best? Is it the last?
Oh yes, in Luxembourg we love rankings, so
Yes.
I hope it's going to be very, very high, but we'll see. As usual, remember, once again, the answer only at the end, and I think after this question we'll talk more about the whole European scale, but I want to come back a little bit again to Luxembourg. And when I was reading and preparing for this interview today, I was also looking at the so-called small state characteristics. And I discovered, I have a problem actually, I'm interested in too many things. So I discovered fascinating research that I had no clue about in exactly this comparison between small states, right? So could we say actually that there are certain challenges or characteristics that are shared by small states when it comes to governance or not?
Indeed. So one thing that a lot of small states have in common is that they do need others, in a way, to survive in the long term. And I don't just mean in terms of defense. I mean, that might be the most obvious thing that people think about, world wars, big neighbors invading you. But it's also in economic terms that small states have a really small market, like we here in Luxembourg. And so when you produce goods, or services, that's often not worth it if you just do it for this national market. So also in economic terms, small states need wider markets. And so they seek what we call shelter. So they try to find either one or two big states that will allow them to be part of their market, part of their sphere of protection, or they will try to join a sort of union or cooperation, which of course in the case of Luxembourg, the biggest or the two biggest factors are NATO for defense and then the European Union for everything else, economic cooperation and so on.
But also there is, as far as I understood, in case of Luxembourg, we are still, landlocked. Which makes it a bit different, right? Because we can also talk about small states and being an island. And that makes it, again, different characteristics.
Indeed. I think what small states often have in common is that they have to be, as said, very open in terms of markets, in terms of trade. But they do indeed have slightly different characteristics. So island states, of course, don't have commuters like our transfrontaliers, because that is usually quite complicated to do that by boat. They often heavily depend on trade and also on tourism and things like this. So many islands have huge tourist sector in their economy, and so are also forced to be very, very open economies. Whereas Luxembourg is, of course, slightly different. We have slightly less tourism in our economy, but we have these transfrontaliers. Of course, we depend on foreign workers, and so also are obliged to be really integrated with our neighbors.
And of course, COVID comes in. I have to mention that because I've been trying to do science podcasts without COVID, but there's just, of course, all of the researchers have done a lot of work related to that, seeing how the landscape changes, how the situation changes. And there has been definitely some kind of reconfiguring, I guess, of the borders because of COVID. I know that this is also part of your research. You looked at that, right? What did the COVID crisis change when it comes to Luxembourg and the borders and the cooperation between states?
Yeah, so the COVID crisis, of course, suddenly made the borders in Europe real again. So a lot of states immediately closed their borders, especially towards citizens from heavily infected countries, but then more and more borders simply closed. For example, more or less all of the borders around Germany. And so, of course, in areas like the Grande Région here around Luxembourg, where we are not used to having borders and you cross borders all the time, you don't even notice they are there. Suddenly there were physical borders, road closures, the German police literally physically closing the road and then just keeping a few checkpoints open. And this really changed things, of course, for Luxembourg, because it affected it made us worry about our commuters, how we could bring them in. It actually also mattered for islands, even though they, of course, have much stronger natural borders. But for them, for example, tourism, the global economy was then also kept out by the lack of ships traveling, for example, during the COVID crisis. So they were also very, very heavily affected.
Does it mean that the policies have changed now to adapt for the next crisis, or we're back to square one?
No, I think there we are really back to square one. So Luxembourg was one of the few countries that didn't close its borders because it depended on its commuters, of course, and that had to negotiate then with its neighbors to slowly reopen the borders or to let through the commuters, for valid work-related reasons. The European Union tried to coordinate these policies, but this is actually something that I think the EU did very poorly. Because borders are such a sign of sovereignty, I think even towards the end of the COVID crisis, the EU did not really have a common system of rules for when people can travel to a different country and what kind of documents you need and, vaccination or test and how long. So that always remained national. And I think that was something that for many European citizens was really frustrating.
At the same time, there was a good website where you could check all this. That was really well run, and there was all the updated information. I was really relying a lot on it, because otherwise, exactly, it was very confusing. And there were just lists, and then you had to go to different, of course, it kept changing because of the crisis as well. So that meant a bit of a tricky situation.
It was also, for larger states, sometimes really frustrating inside a state. Germany, due to federalism, and then even below the federal level, within the states, you have then again other territorial units. And then at some point, every unit had its own rules. So it's not just the Länder that had each their own rules, as if you were traveling abroad, but then even the districts below the land level had their own rules. And this is, of course, for the normal person traveling within a country, a complete nightmare.
So now we have the COVID crisis and other crises we kind of touched upon. In the very beginning, you talked democracy as well. So I just wanted to ask as well, how resilient is democracy? Open question nowadays. After all these crises we've been through, energy crisis, the war, of course, COVID, as we mentioned, where are we?
Well, satisfaction with democracy has declined a little. And especially in the middle of the crises, when people are really frustrated with how things go, you can see that there's a dip in the satisfaction with democracy. Nevertheless, I think it's actually quite resilient, and we often overestimate the problem in the sense that when you look at most of these crises, the overwhelming majority of citizens are actually quite happy to switch into crisis mode and to go along. So citizens are able to tell the difference between normal politics and the need to do something to cope with an exceptional situation. I think you saw this during the lockdown, that actually people were the least dissatisfied with politics during the hardest lockdown of COVID in the first couple of months, because they understood that there are really no vaccines. We didn't know how to treat COVID. People were dying in other countries, that it was better to be on the safe side. So I think there was overwhelming support when you look at the surveys in Luxembourg for the lockdown policies. And it's the same now with the Russian crisis, when we have to switch our gas supply, our energy supplies, and therefore citizens need to save energy so that we can actually manage that. I think when you look at the statistics, people have actually been participating in that process. And I think it's not just because energy is expensive, but also because at least during the first few months, people are actually willing to make a sacrifice and to try and facilitate that change.
Yeah, first few months, and then?
First few months, then eventually they get tired. So eventually you need to figure out a solution. Yes.
Where are we with this actually? Because it's not first few months, is it?
No, this may have to go on for another year, I think. But then I do think that at some point next year, next summer, 2024, we will have then managed this switch to different supplies.
Do you think it's going to be some kind of a European solution, or it's going to be at the governmental level?
That remains to be seen. So today I saw that the European Union launched an initiative to buy energy as the European Union, to avoid the situation which happened so far, that the different countries just offer higher prices and then buy the gas that another state wanted to buy just at a higher price. So now we are trying to do what we did with the masks, to buy things, together. And we have to see how that works, and if people really stick with this, the states, if they're willing to really go with this. But it's a good first step.
But also I was just thinking what you mentioned before, this whole idea of doing something together, but we are not going to go into Brexit too much. But I was just wondering, as you studied in London and then in Edinburgh, and European studies, European politics, but in a country that is not part of EU anymore. When you study it there, can you say that it's objectively pro-European when you study it in a country that is outside of the European Union right now? Is there, I know it should be objective, such studies, but in general, is there a certain view that you got because you studied there that was different than if you studied later on as you were in Bruges? Did you notice that there was a bit of a change of the approach?
Actually, not so much. I think it was fairly similar. And I would say even, I'm the director of our Master in European Governance, and I would say that is also actually very similar in the kind of tone to the British system, to Maastricht or Bruges, where I was. So I think people overestimate how pro-European it is, because it is really about analyzing institutions and how well they work. So there's almost, in political science, there's almost always an element of criticism, because otherwise you can't improve. If you don't criticize, you cannot move forward. That's not the same as Euroscepticism, of course, because we look at this in I would say, in a less emotional way, with the idea of trying to find what doesn't work, how you can improve it, recommendations, and so on. But so just a more critical, but in a constructive, critical view.
I've been trying for how many? 25 minutes not to ask you, what about the future too much? But you know how it is. That's the moment when I have to ask you, so what can we improve in your opinion? What can be done?
Okay, so I think one thing that will be done, hopefully, is this cooperation in the gas sector. That the energy sector, especially buying energy, producing energy, was relatively nationalized. I think there we are now moving towards a more common effort that involves more solidarity. That could be a good thing. And I think also in the defense sector, there might be a stronger European bloc within NATO, as I think we do all feel the need to have a stronger collective defense. And we now remember that our neighbors are worth something in the middle of the crisis. So I think that is something that will evolve potentially in a very positive way that might please citizens. I think one area that parties have been working on, but that still needs to improve, is actually European elections and how they are fought. And here I can actually bring it back to Luxembourg. That, for example, in 2019, I looked at the electoral programs and I was tasked to analyze them for a bigger project looking at the elections across all of Europe. And they are all really similar, these different manifestos. So, the Greens were a little bit more vocal on climate change, but everybody had climate change. As said, the LSRP a little bit more on social Europe, but a lot of parties said social Europe. And so it's tiny little differences. And I think there it's really difficult then for the citizen to participate in European politics. I think we need more of a genuine debate about different policies and alternative policies like we have on the national level, where in Germany, Britain, Luxembourg, we see a competition on what is a fair tax system or what is a fair pension system. I think we also need that for the European level.
I totally agree. Without all the knowledge that you have, I totally agree with that, because it's already sometimes tricky, the programs and how relevant they are to what the politicians say and do. That's a different story. But yet again, it's very difficult to actually tell the parties apart and to understand where they're going as a European party. It kind of tends to be more, okay, this politician is from this national party and he's in that party. So then if I'm supporting this national party, I'm going to support that national party instead of actually, looking at the overarching picture. So good point. Yes, I'm with you on that. As I promised, and I teased it. So now we're slowly going other direction. So coming back to the question that you asked, so I will ask you now to repeat it, please, and then give us the answer, and we'll continue talking about the bigger picture, so European politics as such.
So the question was about the fact that the European Parliament is not the only parliament involved in the EU, that national parliaments also play a role by controlling their national governments and what they do in the Council of Ministers. And so the question was, how powerful is the Luxembourgish parliament compared to the other national parliaments? If we were to rank all 27, where would Luxembourg end up?
And the answer is?
The answer is roughly 21st out of 27. So not very good.
No, I don't think this ranking has been published in any place that I've seen. Okay, why is it this low?
Well, I think there is one dimension that, it won't surprise people who know Luxembourgish politics, because even in domestic politics, so even in normal Luxembourgish politics, the parliament is actually comparatively weak. That is one of the things that the constitutional reform will now also, or has now looked into as well, strengthening the rights to create committees of inquiry, for example, making that easier so that the parliament can be more effective in controlling the government. And this national weakness, it's the same that we have, of course, in European politics. So, for example, there are countries like Finland or the Netherlands where the government, the minister, goes to the national parliament before every single Council of Minister meeting and has to explain exactly what will be discussed and what the position of the country will be. And the parliament then mandates. So mandate means the parliament says what the position should be, and so corrects the position of the government, and this is binding. So the government, if it needs to change or move in a different direction, then it will have to explain that move afterwards and justify it. And so these parliaments are very, very powerful. And for example, that is something we don't do in Luxembourg. We are much less active in scrutinizing what is happening, what the ministers say in the European Union. The European debates tend to be, relatively superficial. So I think there is really a lot of work that can be done there. And often we don't discuss European issues because people more or less agree on them. So I think there is really more that can be done.
Oh, yes, definitely. So who's first, actually, in that ranking? Who's the strongest, do you know?
Finland.
Finland, okay,
Yes.
That's why you mentioned.
But really, there are quite a number of parliaments that have this power to mandate the government, to control the government, where the government then reports back either in writing or again in person on what it has achieved. And this is really taken seriously. So there is a strong expectation that the government respects the voice of parliament. And it's not in the Luxembourgish tradition to do that. So here we have more of a very strong party loyalty tradition, where the role of the parliamentary majority is to just support the government, and the role of the opposition is to criticize. But, they are not as aware of the kind of the status and honor of the parliament as an institution. And, that they could at times come together and fight for more powers for their institution collectively. And I have one nice anecdote in the context of Brexit where, the Luxembourgish government had commissioned a report on the impact of Brexit on the economy of Luxembourg. So this is quite an important report, of course, important to know. And the parliament wanted to read it and asked if they could see it. And the government essentially answered, no, if you want one, commission your own. And this, for example, in Britain would not be thinkable. Their parliament would say, this is parliament, we want this report, it's an important report. You now have that many days, either you send it or we might actually oust the government. Because it's then, in moments like these, it's not about whether you're in favor of a government policy or against it, but it's really about the rights of parliament as an institution. And that can, cut across a government and opposition divide and unite parliamentarians. And I think we need a little bit more of that in Luxembourg, that the parliament comes together and says, no, actually, we want that report.
All the more that, for me, parliament is way more representative of the citizens. In theory, at least, we're choosing those people. So it would be good that it had more control over the government, right? Because we're not choosing the prime minister, are we?
Indeed. So I think there is some work that is being done in the parliament. They created a new research unit so that the parliament can get better information itself from its own staff members. So I think there is an awareness that the parliament could function better, that it could do more. And I think also politicians are then working on that. But just really, that would be my main recommendation. Sometimes when it's about the power of the institution, be a little bit nastier and just insist on your rights and demand the information.
So what happened then? Like, they didn't get the report?
No, I think they didn't get it.
So we don't know what the government knew about the impact of Brexit.
I think that is a very typical thing, actually, for Luxembourg.
Okay.
So that, where also in the Netherlands, for example, similar to Britain, it's just people would be a bit more, insisting on this and saying, well, you need a majority to govern, and even the majority MPs would then insist on the rights of parliament.
You mentioned that you compare with the Netherlands, with Belgium, with Germany as well. So what about Germany? How is it working there? It's a completely different context as well.
But also a very, very powerful parliament. So there's also, despite the fact that Germany also has, of course, strong party loyalty towards government. But in institutional matters, the Bundestag has quite extensive rights and usually also watches over those rights so that they are respected, that government is responsive to parliament. And one challenge that also affected, I think, parliaments in general, not just the Luxembourgish parliament, are these many crises, because they are an excuse to some extent, or sometimes there's a necessity to make decisions very quickly. And then parliaments don't have time to debate, or have hardly any time to debate, or they get a document and a few hours later they have their plenary debate, so no time to prepare. And that affects the quality of parliamentary work. So with this constant crisis mode, it's actually not good for the status of parliaments.
I just am fascinated with the fact that you're able to explain everything to me without any jargon. This is really, really impressive, because I have a list of jargon that you use in your articles, and I was thinking like, oh, maybe she will mention that. No, it's not there. So I wanted some, explanations as well, because of course I'm myself and I love reading scientific articles, whichever subject it is. But of course, one of the problems, even you read the abstract and you're like, okay, this I don't know, this I don't know, this I don't know. So we start with, this Europeanization of national parliaments. But I was waiting for you to mention something about mainstreaming and decentralization. You didn't say that. So I have to ask now directly, what is that? Why do you talk about it in your articles?
Yes, in my work, I talk a lot about the mainstreaming of European affairs in parliaments. And again, we actually sort of pick it up, that term, in academia, because it is similar to this gender mainstreaming. And it literally means that there is a trend in national parliaments that European affairs get integrated into all parts of parliament. So as you know, Parliament has a plenary where all the MPs or all the députés come together and debate. But a lot of the work is done in committees, so you have different committees for different policy areas. And usually you have one European Affairs Committee. That's another jargon where I say EAC in my work.
Yes.
So it's the European Affairs Committee that, of course, does a lot of work on European affairs, does the bulk of the work. But increasingly, because Europe affects so many policy areas, the other committees like environment or transport, justice and home affairs, or like interior politics or security and so on, they take over European affairs that fall into this policy area. So all the committees increasingly have to look at European affairs. And Luxembourg is one of the countries where this really happens, where because the parliament is so small, every committee is supposed to read, and deal with the European policy proposals that fall into their area of expertise.
And does it mean that the AACs actually cease to exist? Or is it that, in each committee you have to have a specialist on the European affairs? How do the parliaments deal with that?
The European Affairs Committees usually still continue to exist because they still play a role in controlling government, in keeping an eye on the overall situation, on the broader debates about treaties, for example, or future evolution, the broader crises. But it's just that certain technical things, for example, under the... here's a jargon, early warning system.
No, I actually complimented you. I don't want more jargon. This was just very good.
There is a European mechanism where every new European law has to be assessed by national parliaments for whether it is really a law that should be made on the European level or whether it would make more sense to do that on the national level. And that, because you look at very, very specific laws, that is often done then by the technical committees.
You see, I'm really not trying to influence you to use words that I don't understand. So, and I think this is the moment we should be slowly wrapping up because you're getting into that and I'm not going to be following you anymore. But anyway, it was really interesting. I have a feeling we really only scratched the surface. There's so much going on. And I really hope that a lot of our listeners will say like, oh, I need to read more. I need to check more. I want to understand what is happening there because I haven't really paid that much attention. And maybe we'll meet before the European elections. I hope maybe earlier, who knows, but I hope to talk to you again soon. And it was really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Anna-Lena.
Thank you. And don't read my articles because there you will find the jargon.
That's very interesting. And normally the scientists say the exact opposite, right? But yes, okay, don't. Then listen to Anna-Lena in different places or maybe as a guest next time for the podcast. And this is it for today. Of course, I hope you enjoyed it as much as me. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to check what we're writing on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, wherever you're getting your podcasts. Check us out. And of course, suggest also next guests. This was Silux, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.